Well, hello, and welcome back to AOPA's Pilot Information Center live stream webinar series. Our topic for this episode is aircraft co-ownership. I'm Ferdy Mack with AOPA's Pilot Information Center in Frederick, Maryland. This webinar is brought to you by AOPA Aviation Finance. For more information on how we can help you, you can visit our finance website at finance.aopa.org or call 800-62-PLANE. That's 800-627-5263. This episode is episode 1 in a 3-part series that we are providing this year on aircraft ownership. Tonight, we will cover aircraft co-ownership specifically, the practical and legal considerations. Before we get started, I'd like to remind our viewers that you can subscribe to our AOPA YouTube channel by using the red subscribe button just below the video. Also, during the live presentation, you can send us your questions in the chat box just to the right of the video. We will answer the most popular questions at the end of this hour-long presentation. Also, if you are not watching this live, please feel free to contact us with your questions at 800-872-2672. That's 800-USA-AOPA, Monday through Friday, 8:30 a.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Or you can email us at pilotassist@aopa.org. Joining me today are Mike Filucci and Ray Speciale. Mike is AOPA's Vice President of AOPA's Pilot Information Center and our Flight Operations Department, and he has bought and sold 5 airplanes so far in his aviation career, Mike. Mike, thanks for being here.
Good to be here, Ferdy, Ray, everyone. Welcome.
All right, and Ray is one of our AOPA Pilot Protection Services staff attorneys, as well as being a CPA, and he often has to utilize his skills in both domains at the same time, I would imagine. Welcome, Ray.
It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks. Welcome, everybody.
All right. Well, thanks for being here. So let's get started. Mike, can you give us an overview on how we're going to cover co-ownership this evening?
Well, there's a list of topics we're going to run through tonight. Why co-ownership, finding the right match, financing, registering your aircraft under a co-ownership agreement, co-ownership agreements themselves, transferring co-ownership interests, and then finally at the end, as you said, we'll have questions, Ferdy.
Okay, great. So Ray, start us off with some tantalizing features. Why might co-ownership be right for me?
Okay, we'll go ahead and start with that because this is often the starting point for when members contact us and want to know about how should I set up my aircraft ownership, right?
Sure.
And what I often describe to the members is that what we're talking about here is probably the simplest form of ownership when we're reviewing co-ownership. The simplest form of ownership when you're trying to get multiple parties and presumably to help defray costs on the aircraft. So co-ownership brings with it that simplicity, that frugal approach, right? Because it's probably the least expensive of the various approaches. Mm-hmm. And usually when we're talking about this, we're often contrasting it with what goes on with a limited liability company. Maybe a corporation, but often the other option for multiple owners is going to be the limited liability company. We're going to be dealing with limited liability companies in the second series, as I recall, second of this series. But just to give you some flavor, with an LLC there is going to be a much greater expense, depending on the complexity of it. But with an LLC, you're going to have to deal with setting it up, maintaining it annually. You'll often have to deal with tax compliance issues. Often leases are going to be involved. I would estimate that for most members, the range of cost is going to be somewhere between $200 a year to $2,000 a year, depending on the complexity. So that's often what we're referring to when we talk about the cost of the LLC. So what it often comes down to is the simplicity and the somewhat cheaper element of running a co-ownership versus the complexity of an LLC. And with an LLC also comes the benefit, though, of eliminating to some degree, it's not perfect, the notion or the possibility of cross liability between the members. In other words, with a co-ownership, each member could wind up becoming legally responsible for the actions of their co-owner. In an LLC, the general notion is that each member of the LLC would not necessarily be liable for the mishaps or negligence of their other members. And that's really the trade-off that we're talking about when we discuss this with members.
And that's a significant trade-off by the sound of it, yeah?
It is. We'll talk about insurance a little bit later, but that is in fact one of the big factors in deciding which approach you're going to use for multiple owners. The co-ownership with its simplicity, lower cost, versus the LLC, which has some protection from personal liability, but the expense. And what everybody has to remember as well is that whenever you're operating the aircraft as PIC, you're going to be exposed to personal liability.
Sure, and we'll get into those details
You
in
bet.
a little bit. So Mike, we've got a lot of different types of airplanes out there, a lot of different types of pilots. How do we make sure we're plugging in the right group to create the most healthy ownership ecosystem?
Well, you know, in any aircraft purchase, whether it's as an individual or as a co-ownership, you always have to match the aircraft to the mission. And it becomes somewhat more complicated when you have co-ownership, because when you have multiple individuals involved, they may have conflicting missions and require different aircraft. So that's one thing you have to consider. What are the intended uses of the aircraft? Is it going to be business? Is it going to be pleasure? Some mix of the two? And then how are you going to schedule the aircraft so that it's harmonious between the co-owners? You know, you could have one co-owner, for instance, who strictly wants an airplane for business use, and another that just wants to take his family to the beach on weekends. Well, that could work out rather well. But if everybody wants to take their family to the beach on weekends, and then there could be conflicts. So that's one of the things you have to consider. And then you have to consider, you know, are the personalities compatible, or do you have an odd couple situation where you have Felix and Oscar? You know, so you have to consider that. And then there are all the administrative and accounting needs that have to be addressed. Who's going to take responsibility for the accounting, the administrative functions, and then of course maintenance is a big item for aircraft co-ownership. Who's going to take the lead on maintenance? Because you've got the regular scheduled maintenance, and there's always maintenance issues that crop up in the course of a year when you own an airplane.
Okay, so it sounded just like you touched on the idea that there are some components there that have various financial degrees of involvement. We've got Adam Meredith to help us out, giving us a little bit of information on how the ownership structure might relate to whether or not, or to what extent, aircraft financing might be available.
So two items to be to look at are you going to have it registered as an LLC, and will you be co-owners within that LLC, or will the aircraft actually be registered to two co-owners? Those things are important semantics when you're looking at the registration and the loan documentation that the lenders are going to need. The second part that's important in it is how exactly the plane is going to be used, and assuming it's for personal or business, incidental business use, there's no issues. The other challenge that we run into is if there's any kind of a lease back from you to a flight school, to a flying club, those things matter. The co-ownership is something that the banks can deal with and are aware of, but they just need to know that up front. If they don't know until the last minute that you're going to be doing co-ownership, it can cause some problems in the documentation process, and potentially some lenders who you may have already been referred to, if they didn't know that that was the way that the structure was going to be, would say, this isn't something we're comfortable with. Without getting too technical in terms of what they need, it's basically going to be a subordination agreement in the event that one of the partners is paying cash and the other one is financing. What that does is it allows the bank to have a formal relationship with the co-owner who's paying in cash, and that relationship's important both ways, not only for the bank but also for that co-owner to say, hey, look, if my partner is not current, I have the ability to step up and bring it current, and you're not going to come in and take the plane. Other than that, it's important to let us know up front, and that's probably the most important thing about it. So,
Thank you. Let me adjust level. Can you give me one more time? So Ray, as Adam said, the ownership structure can affect the financial composition of how the aircraft's paid for, whether or not you can get financing. Can you give us some more detail there?
Sure. Just to reiterate, yes, it can be far more complex if we're talking about a group of owners, right, instead of just one. One of the things that I'll generally try to advise clients to do, if in fact they're thinking about a co-ownership, is to essentially bring their money to the table so that the aircraft can be purchased for cash, because there are in fact there's a great deal of complexity if in fact you've got a co-ownership as a group that's actually borrowed the money for the aircraft and the aircraft is now collateralizing a loan. Just think about it. Members may want to withdraw. People get different jobs, they leave, people die, people have a lot of things that happen to them in the meantime. So it's probably better to find a way to have each person, in essence, finance their share of the aircraft directly, however they can do that, bring that money to the table, pay cash, and you basically can eliminate a lot of these potential hazards. It is true, though, that if that aircraft is used as collateral, the bank is generally going to want each co-owner to guarantee that loan. And if you think about it, you can have one co-owner that defaults, can't pay, leaves, and now everybody else is held, sort of holding the bag on that kind of loan. And that can often be a big problem with a co-ownership. And that's why I will typically advise that they finance on their own. So that's just one bit of advice that I give as a practical matter in these arrangements.
Sure.
Okay, so we've found the right airplane. We've found a couple of pilots that we are firmly convinced we want to go into this agreement with. We've figured out the money situation. The next thing we're going to need to do is do the deal. So, Mike, how do we go about starting the paperwork? What does FAA need from us?
Well, it starts with a bill of sale, of course, the AD50-2. And the thing to remember in a co-ownership agreement is it's not a corporation buying, it's not an LLC buying, it's actually individuals buying the aircraft under a co-ownership agreement. So all the co-owners, all the individuals, whether it's 2 or 3 or more, have to be listed on the bill of sale when it goes off to the FAA.
So there are a collection of individuals that constitute the co-ownership buying party.
Exactly, a collection of individuals.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Ray, what else do we need besides a bill of sale?
Well, if you're going to go ahead and get that bill of sale, you've got that ready to go, your next step is going to be to get the airplane registered. Mm-hmm. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about now. One of the first things you need to know is that that's a Form 8050-1. The good news is nowadays you can find that form online. And you don't need to have those old carbon forms anymore.
I miss the triplicate carbon forms so much.
You may be the only person in the world who misses that then, Ferdy. But they are, in fact, making it a little bit easier. And when we're talking about registration, I want to keep in mind what Mike was talking a little bit about earlier was that bill of sale. And the example we're going to be used in running through this entire presentation is going to be our co-ownership of A, B, and C. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now we're talking about the registration, and what you should be thinking about is that under the type of registration, which is right at the top of that form, and this sounds like it might be a little bit, too obvious, but you've got to be very careful. You want to make sure that you're tagging this as a co-ownership, not a partnership. People often refer to a co-ownership as a partnership, and I'm sure you guys hear this a lot over at PIC, but it's not a partnership. A partnership is generally viewed in the law as a group of individuals who are getting together in order to make a profit with the objective of profit making. And the co-ownership is not that. It's really just a collection of individuals who want to share the cost of aircraft ownership. So make sure that you're indicating that this is indeed a co-ownership, not a partnership. You can call each other partners, but you're really co-owners. That's fine.
As we talked about in our rehearsal, like a moth to the flame, so often when people have that 8050-1 form in front of them, their eyes are drawn to partnership. And co-ownership seems like a less attractive option for some reason, or a less understandable option, and partnership seems like the obvious option. It's not. It's the other way around. So we always encourage pilots to give us a call at the Pilot Information Center. We can help you step you through that 8050-1 aircraft registration form. It is easy. I've done it myself to send one into Oak City and get it kicked back. When you get it kicked back, hopefully your temporary is still good. They just send you a nice form letter, and it's got a dozen check boxes, and they check the one that explains what you did wrong, and then you go and rectify the form, send it back in. It still takes the same number of weeks to get through, and it's not a ding on your pilot record, but it does take a little bit of time if you're anxious to get that deal done.
Right, and the next two items on the slide that I had there for the first slide for registration were that each co-owner's name needs to be noted under the name of applicant. So you want to make sure each individual's name is there, and each co-owner is going to need to sign that aircraft registration form as well.
Printed and signed.
That's right,
And
exactly. And actually, right now they do indicate where they want you to print. Before you had to do it, and there was no indication that you had to print it on the old forms.
That's
right?
what got me, actually.
That's right.
Yep.
Okay. So the couple of other points that are important about the registration, and this is on the next slide that we had there. The FAA is going to assume that each co-owner is an equal owner in that aircraft. All right, that's the way that they assume this is being set up. If equal ownership is not what you intended, okay, for any reason, and I rarely see this, but every once in a while we do, then what you should do is, and the advice I'd give is that both on the bill of sale and on the registration application, you indicate, perhaps parenthetically next to each person's name, what percentage or fraction of ownership that there would be. So in our fictional example here of co-owners A, B, and C, if they had any different percentages in mind, for instance, A's 40%, B's 40%, and C's 20%, you would indicate that there, all right? Now, it's also important to note that that won't show up necessarily on the permanent registration certificate, but for all time, that will be documented in the FAA documents that are sitting there in Oklahoma City. I'd also like to remind everybody that in order to get this thing registered as a co-ownership, each of the co-owners is going to need to be a U.S. citizen or a resident alien, okay, green card holder. And then finally that, and this is important too, for any kind of aircraft purchase, you need to be aware of whether or not there's going to be some kind of sales or use tax consequence in your state. Every state is different. This is something that needs to be researched as you're looking at a purchase so that you can budget it in to whatever it is that you're looking to purchase. So do take a look at that before you make the purchase to avoid nasty surprises.
Especially if it's your first time in, it could be quite a surprise.
And it could be unavoidable because
right.
The FAA records are accessed by the various states from time to time. They know when transfers have taken place. They track down the registration address. Next thing you know, you've got a letter that says, congratulations, we hear you bought an airplane, and now we want your 5 or 6% or whatever percent it is for the state. So it is something to be aware of, and you'd also want to be aware if there are any applicable exemptions ahead of that. So that's another topic altogether, but it is important to note.
There are some states have flyaway exemptions depending on where the deal was made. Sometimes the deal might, taxable consequences for the deal might change depending on where the aircraft came from. Maybe the aircraft came out of Florida, it flew to Georgia where the deal was consummated, and then it returned or came to its new home in Illinois. It gets pretty complicated, and as Ray said, it's too much for us to cover in this episode, but that's yet another topic you can contact the Pilot Information Center on. We can give you some leads on who might be able to help you with those tax situations because they do get fairly complicated fairly quickly.
And you do often need to be in touch with an attorney or a CPA in your state, okay, in order to get the answers to your questions on that. Yep.
All right, so now Ray, we've had have everything squared away. We've got our FAA paperwork in place, but now Mike, what about some sort of, shall we say, contract between, let's say A, B, and C decide to buy an airplane.
Sure.
We're going to need to come to the table and decide on, what's right and what's out of bounds as far as how we're going to operate this little I don't want to call it a business, but this little operation, shall we say.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, aside from all the paperwork that we've sent into the FAA, the legal stuff, this is not something that's required, but it's something we, of course, advise strongly that you draft, and with the help of an attorney, and that is a co-ownership agreement. It's always best to get these things down on paper so that you're not operating from memory 6 months, a year down the line, and so there's no misunderstanding. It may include operating rules, or you may want to have your operating rules as a separate standalone document and not be part of the co-ownership agreement. In addition to that, it's pretty straightforward. You want to identify the parties involved. You want to identify the aircraft. You want to identify how you're going to title the aircraft, and in most cases, it's going to be tenants in common. And then you also, of course, you want to identify where you're going to base the aircraft. And you know, there's some flexibility there, obviously, in any agreement. I knew I had talked to some owners that shared an aircraft, and one owner kept the aircraft in the summertime in the Northeast, and the other owner lived in Florida, and he kept the aircraft for 6 months down in Florida when the grass strip that the owner in the Northeast flew out of was pretty much impassable or too wet in the winter months. It was ideal for the owner in Florida during the winter months. So there's lots of flexibility there. In addition to that, some other key ingredients would be scheduling, how you're going to schedule, how you're going to pay for fixed costs such as hangar, insurance, and all those other fixed costs that go along with aircraft ownership. And of course, there's also the variable expenses that come with operation that are tied to the operating hours of the airplane, like fuel consumption, oil consumption, and that sort of thing. And then finally, something to consider is whether you want to have a pool or a separate fund to fund future maintenance or improvements to the aircraft further down the line.
And it's buried in the variable expenses line, I suppose, but we didn't even talk about that common parlance about wet versus dry rates.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
You know, so in one case you're including fuel, in one case you're not. I've instructed for clubs who have gone both ways. I haven't found that it causes people to be more or less judicious with their use of the throttle or the mixture control, however, but some people seem to be married to one or the other, so that's another consideration.
And right, it is important to keep that in mind. And I'd also say one of the last points that was on Mike's slide was that funding for future maintenance reserves and the dust-ups that we usually see. This is one of the areas that often becomes a bone of contention with folks is if you're not collecting that kind of reserve, it makes it pretty easy for somebody to withdraw right before there's a need. And that's why you would want to do that. It's precisely the reason you would want to do this. So people are paying as they're going, and if you withdraw, you're not leaving behind a big bill.
So we don't have to have a meeting to discuss when we get to hour 2000 on our engine, what do we do now? By then it's already understood and
the funds are set aside.
It
Right.
could be too late by the time we have that meeting, right?
Right.
Yes.
So it would be in some sense codified for our ABC co-ownership in our co-ownership agreement that, you know, when we get to TBO, the money will be there, and we'll be spending it to have the engine overhauled. What if we're a little short? Hopefully that'll be covered in the agreement as well.
It should be covered in agreement. You can, you know, we're talking about the key ingredients in the agreement. You always try to capture as much of what could happen in there. It's never going to be perfect, but you do want to try to capture as much as you can. And these key ingredients that we're talking to people about here are really meant to act as an outline for an agreement that's professionally drafted. And that can be amended from time to time as people might agree to do that.
And of course, as an aside, as part of our AOPA's pilot protection services, you can have attorneys like Ray help review your documents if you're looking to get into an agreement as part of your pilot protection services fees.
Right. Well, often where that comes in is when we're talking about a buy-sell. There is coverage for buy-sell, and this would be something that would indeed be a part of that process. Yes.
Excellent.
No doubt.
Yet another another reason you can contact us for assistance. So, Ray, let's get back to insurance.
Right.
We talked about liability a little bit early on,
Right.
and I'm not going to say you scared me, but we talked about various ways in which I'm not flying the airplane, but I still might be on the hook.
Right.
So, is insurance part of that equation?
Absolutely. This is the one of the key ingredients to the agreement.
Okay.
This is just one of the things we're talking about here, but it's something that everybody really needs to come to agreement on. It might even have an impact on the compatibility that Mike was talking about a little bit earlier of the various co-owners. Just a few thoughts to be mindful of as you're thinking about insurance. And some of this is, anecdotal. It's information I've accumulated over the years. I've spoken to different agents. But you do need to be mindful that generally, if you have more than 4 or 5 owners, co-owners, it might be looked upon as a flying club. And if that happens, the rates are going to go up. So usually we're talking about no more than 4 or 5 people. There may be exceptions to that, but that's usually what we'll see.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing to be mindful of, and this really isn't just for co-ownerships, this would really be for just about any purpose, is you want to know whether or not there are sub-limits on your policy. And let me explain what I mean. Generally with piston-driven aircraft, you're going to be able to get a liability limit of about $1 million. That's what we see typically. But what may come with that is a series of sublimits, which basically will say something like, we are limiting liability to $100,000, for instance, per passenger or per seat or per person. And if you see that, what it is saying is exactly what you're hearing, right? And that is that, and exactly what you're reading, and that is that in fact, if there was an accident and someone was seriously hurt, or worse, if they were killed, they're going to get, in essence, $100,000 for that. So it's something to be mindful of. And to get a smooth policy, what you're often going to need is about 500 hours of total time, and usually about 250 hours in type and make and model. And usually that, has to be tied in with no claims in the last 5 years or so. One other thing to think about, and I think we got this in the slide here, is that if you've got an open pilot clause there, it may disappear once you get to 4 or 5 members. That's something that you'll have to discuss individually with your broker or underwriter in order to make sure that you understand what the rules are going to be for that. The reason I said that this might involve a compatibility issue is because if you want smooth limits, if you don't want those sublimits in the policy, you may need to have, if it's your A, B, and C, you may need to have 3 pilots with similarly higher levels of experience.
Okay.
If you bring in 1 pilot who may not have that level of experience, you may not be able to get those smooth limits. And so along with some of the other issues that Mike was referring to earlier appropriately about compatibility, this is one other area where you might want to find some compatibility.
Sure.
So this would actually be an interesting point to contrast, because with a flying club, you might want to work hard to be able to cover a wider variety of pilot skills. You might want to be able to provide instruction to that primary student, or to have that student, private pilot without an instrument rating, able to fly this maybe retract, maybe 200, maybe a Cardinal, for example, as well as the higher qualified pilots, to attract more people into the club.
That's right.
This is a different thing.
It is.
This is a different thing.
But it's still the same principle. If you want to get the smooth limits, you've got to have the capability. You've got to have the folks who are going to be experienced enough.
Okay. So what other facets of insurance do we need to discuss here?
Well, one other thing I might add to this, and really would be added to the list, but it's more, again, anecdotal. My advice would be, and no hate mail, please, but I'm just telling you that my advice on these things is, if you're going to spend money on a multiple ownership arrangement, and the amount of money was, the choice between, this is the money we'd be spending on an LLC versus a co-ownership, I tend to advise folks, if you're going to put the money into something, put it into a higher limit policy. Put it into a policy with no sublimits. Not everybody's going to agree with that, I know. So don't, you might disagree, but that's what I would urge people to do.
Okay. So beyond insurance, what other considerations might we want to have for long-term contingency planning in our co-ownership agreement?
One of the things that we will often see problems with are when folks fail to make arrangements, when we're talking about some of these key ingredients, for options on the aircraft. Okay. So for instance, what you want to be careful about is if you want to add higher end avionics, what is it going to take to trigger that expenditure, right? Does everybody need to agree? Do 2 out of 3 need to agree? This is the sort of thing that we're going to need to sort out at the beginning. Actually, this is one of those things that causes the most dust-ups, at least another one that we see. You also want to take a look at, well, what are we going to need to do in case one of the owners wants to leave, okay? What are the approaches that we're going to have for voluntary withdrawal from the co-ownership, right? And also, what standards will we have for admitting new co-owners? We just talked about insurance. That might be part of the standards that you're going to have to put in place, right?
Yeah.
These are all things that need to be thought about and laid out ahead of time. One sad topic, or one that you might not have to deal, or you might not want to deal with, but you might have to deal with, is what happens if a co-owner is delinquent on their payments, right? They're not able to meet their obligations. How long are you going to give them in their delinquency, right? How are you going to respond to that? Often it's going to wind up in termination, but you want to have a process for that that's laid out so that not anybody is sitting out there and wondering, how is this going to work? And you sure want to avoid having to litigate it.
So on this slide, before we move on, we talked a little bit about optional aircraft improvements.
Sure.
In this era right now, with 2020 coming up, I'm hearing alarm bells going off, ADS-B. So there may be co-ownerships out there right now that didn't even know that ADS-B was coming or that it was going to be a requirement at some point, and now it is. So if that's not already codified in their co-ownership agreement, A, B, and C are going to have to sit down at the table and figure out, what are we going to buy? How much is it going to cost? Where's the money going to come from? When do we want to do it? Because we've even got this sliding scale now as far as that game of chicken. Do we want to equip sooner and ensure a spot in the shop, at the radio shop, or do we want to wait? Maybe the equipment will get cheaper and there'll be more options, but maybe we won't make it for 2020. That whole ball of wax probably wasn't in many co-ownership agreements.
No, but if in fact they had put something in there about a reserve, it certainly might mitigate the problem.
Okay, so we don't have to have ADS-B listed in particular, but the document would include, improvement line items and how to approach that.
Right, and I would be sure to make to try to be as realistic as possible, because things are going to change. There's going to be upgrades needed, and if anything, you'd want to err on the conservative side to make sure you've got enough funds there. I'll even suggest to co-owners that money be sequestered in a separate account. That way it can't be touched, and it's sort of lockboxed until it's needed.
Sure.
Yeah.
So before we move on to the next slide, talking about other co-ownership agreement potential pitfalls, I do want to remind our viewers out there, do keep sending your questions. We're taking a look at them as we go, and in a short while, when we get to the end of our slides, we will be answering your questions. So don't forget to chat us up in the chat box. If you have technical issues or questions, we've got Eric Rush out there helping you from AOPA's I&T department, and meanwhile I'll be watching for the content to come by. So let's get back to the co-ownership agreement. I guess we're going to talk about, you talked about a bad situation where someone becomes delinquent. I thought you were actually going to talk about this bad situation, which is, what if A, B, or C becomes deceased?
Right. Unavoidable, right? Inevitable, but it does happen.
Nobody
and,
gets out alive.
Yep.
Right, and in fact, there should be a provision in the agreement for what we do when we have a co-owner who might pass on. And normally the objective here is going to be to try to get their estate paid off for whatever the value of their share is in the aircraft as soon as possible. You know, you just like you would for a withdrawal, you want to try to figure out the best way to value that potential co-ownership share. There are various approaches for this, and you could use these same approaches for the voluntary withdrawal of a co-owner. One approach I've seen used very regularly and with some success is the approach where you get an appraisal. That's relatively straightforward, and then whatever the appraised value is, you divide it up by the number of co-owners. You might have to make some adjustments for, you know, any delinquencies and things like that, but that's one approach. Another approach that I've seen used with some success has been what I'll call for now an agreed value or set value approach, where at a certain date each year, you go ahead and set a value. Maybe on January 15th each year, you get together, agree on that value, and that's going to be the value of that aircraft that you're going to use for the remainder of the year. There are some pitfalls to that, but there's also some certainty to it as well. And everybody's got some skin in the game at that point. There's various approaches. I've even seen some folks just reference VREF, which might be a little bit scary at times, but it works, and it's cheaper than getting the appraiser. Mm-hmm. So as long as you're thinking about ahead of time, you set the rules, and you go ahead and lay that out for everybody, it tends to work. And with a deceased member, one of the things that's going to be an issue is often going to be how quickly can the payoff occur. So you'd want it to be immediate if possible, but the funds may or may not be there. So sometimes you may have to spread it out over a couple of years. Some folks even ask me about, well, can we do this with life insurance? You might be able to do that, but let's face it, sometimes the members may be at an age where it's just inadvisable and not financially prudent to go ahead and take out life insurance on them. They may not even be able to do it. So while that might be an idea, it doesn't always work. So that's what you would be talking about for, you know, death of a member and paying off the estate. Because remember, when somebody dies, their estate is now the 1/3 owner if we got an A, B, and C. Mm-hmm. Another thing you'd want to take care to at least consider is how are we going to handle things in the unfortunate case of a dispute? Do we want to deal with this through arbitration? Do we want to go straight to the courts? How do we want to handle this? And if we're going to go to arbitration, which arbitrator will we use? There are many of them available. They charge a fee, but sometimes people suggest arbitration, and lawyers will suggest that as a more expeditious approach than going to the courts. I can't tell you that it always is more expeditious, but it is possibly in different circumstances. If you're going to go to the courts, you may want to specify which court, right? Because the folks involved in the co-ownership may all be in different jurisdictions. So you want to settle right at the beginning which court will in fact be the court that this particular dispute will go to. You'd also want to settle up right from the start with respect to which state law will apply. Usually you've got all the co-owners in the same state, but there may be the possibility of co-owners residing in different states if you're somewhere near the border. So these are all part of the key ingredients, I'll call them, to a typical agreement. And those are the sort of legal points. There may also be some others that we can talk about and people might have questions about, but this is usually what we'd see.
So on that topic, Ray, actually, when we talked about arbitration, that resonated a little bit with one of the questions that we have coming in here. One of our viewers says, I'm hoping that they discuss some of the soft stuff about agreements, such as how do you deal with two owners that disagree on an upgrade, for example? How do you deal with that?
Well, that was one of the points in the key ingredients that we were listing.
Well, that's the thing. Let's say it's not adequately covered in the agreement.
If it's not adequately covered in the agreement, you have limited choices, right? If it's a big enough issue, you may want to arbitrate it, but that could be very costly and not recommended if it's going to cost more than the add-on, right?
Upgrade, yeah.
Or the modification. it's not that easy to deal with some of these disputes unless you've addressed it first in the agreement. The parties may, though, agree that they can go to some other third party, maybe not an arbitrator, it may not be as expensive, somebody who they both trust to help them get through the circumstance. But once you get to that point, it can be difficult, and that's exactly why we made that one of the key ingredients there.
Right. And we've actually got some feedback on that. Someone saying, funny, a big danger is when it's between friends and you don't think you need such a formal agreement. Another saying, mediation prior to arbitration or court could work to resolve the issue and still leave further options if you can come to an agreement. And finally, do you actually recommend arbitration? If it's common but so risky because you can't challenge a bad decision, at least in California, it's not that much cheaper than going to court. So it sounds like some people have some experience, some people have some opinions there.
And arbitration is often binding. So what happens there is that the state courts have to essentially honor that arbitration, the decision in arbitration, and you may have some limited options after that. But let's be honest, most of the cases that we see with respect to the co-ownerships for GA aircraft, often it's going to be a real cost-benefit analysis to determine whether or not you're going to really want to battle over these things. And that's the real practical issue that we see.
Right. This isn't a $20 million aircraft.
No, usually it's not, and that's what sometimes makes these problems, it actually escalates them to some degree because you don't have the kind of wherewithal or the kind of amount, the kind of money at stake to go to court or go to arbitration.
But there's more passion.
There is.
There's more passion involved.
And mediation is an approach, but even mediation done by a third party is not cheap.
Right. Right. All right. So, Mike, give us an idea of how we might want to construct our own Part 91 operating rules as it comes to the implementation of our agreement.
Sure. Well, when we talk about operating rules, what we're really talking about here is components of risk management, because we're talking about, and this ties back what Ray was saying earlier about the operating experience of the co-owners. Because if you have two high-time pilots with lots of varied experience, that's going to result in different operating rules than if you have two low-time pilots or even student pilots. So this is where you're going to incorporate things like maybe runway length and type of runways that you're allowed to fly into as a co-owner, whether that be an unimproved strip, a grass strip, or a paved strips only. Whether or not you're going to allow international cross-border operations to Mexico or Canada or the Caribbean, for instance. And then little touchy-feely things like the condition after use, and that's in our fleet here at AOPA. That's an issue. You don't dare return an airplane to the hangar without cleaning the bugs off and cleaning the windshield off, because you'll catch hell from those that follow. Bugs. Can't have bugs. And then some other things to consider as far as operating limitations would be whether you're going to allow for student activity. Student activity tends to be a little harder on an aircraft, so you want to make sure that that's clearly defined in your operating rules. Currency requirements. Of course, we have the FARs that we all live by, but that's something else you're going to have to you may want to incorporate. And then, last but not least, at least in our coverage here, is the whole issue of scheduling priorities, who has priority over use of the airplane, and what kinds of swaps you can make in the scheduling of an airplane if one party needs if both parties need the airplane at the same time. So those are the kinds of things that you want to incorporate into your operating rules.
So, for example, you might want to simply take standard operating procedure, FAA requirements, and maybe make little tweaks. For example, maybe you might require an instrument proficiency check of your pilots every year as opposed to every 2 years, for currency perspective, or be a flight review, whichever it is that you might want to step up the frequency a little bit.
Yeah, whatever you're comfortable. As I said, this is a risk management issue, and it's whatever all the co-owners are comfortable with in terms of how they manage the risk. Because if the airplane is damaged, of course, then both parties are going to end up in the financial bags, as Ray said.
One thing I'd say about, though, it might be somewhat disagreeing with what was said in terms of the currency requirements, and I think we've chatted about this in the past, and it's something that everybody may not agree on, but once you set those up as rules, you are to some degree bound by them.
Sure.
So if you're gonna say, well, you need that check every month or two, right?
It's now the new gold standard.
It's the gold standard, right? And you may, in fact, increase exposure to liability by doing that. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but it could be a problem.
Look, it says right here.
That's right.
Explain to me
why you didn't do it.
in court. Why
you didn't do it.
Yeah.
Right. So I'd be careful about that and talk to local counsel about it before you start adding requirements like that.
Sure. One party can say, hey, I'm in compliance with the FARs, and the other partner could say, hey, but we have this in our operating rules.
The FARs are pretty good standards, and I'd say that they're often enough. But I do think on things, for instance, like, well, do we want the aircraft used on a grass strip, right? I have seen disputes about this.
Mm-hmm.
That's the sort of thing that you'd want to iron out in that agreement.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's move on. So we've had A, B, and C. We've had a wonderful time with this aircraft. This Cardinal, I think I picked out for us early on. But now it's time to change the composition of the co-ownership. One of us wants out, or someone else wants in, and they backed a dump truck full of money up to my house, and I just couldn't say no. So I'm going to saddle you guys with this new party, or vice versa. So how do we go about doing that?
All right. Well, so now we're sort of at the end of the co-ownership, right?
Precisely.
The co-ownership as it's known.
Right.
So the next slide just gives you a little bit of a graphic and an example on what's going to happen in case one member, and we'll just say C, decides to withdraw. Okay, and once C leaves, really all we've got left is A and B. So how is that going to be handled? It's really not too complex, but it's sometimes not as intuitive as people might think. What's going to happen is in the bill of sale, and that's of course the 8050-2 that we were talking about a little bit earlier, A, B, and C are now going to transfer ownership of that aircraft to A and B. And so the purchaser.
So Mike's leaving us.
Mike's leaving us?
Oh, no, I'm
so
sorry, C. I'm leaving.
Were you C?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're leaving.
Excuse
Sorry.
me.
Bye-bye, Ferdy.
Right.
And so then Mike and I will be the two that are left, A and B, okay, or however we said it before. But it's going to be A and B who are going to be left. And then A and B, Mike and I would then be responsible for registering the aircraft as a new co-ownership in the name of A and B. The other thing to consider here, and a lot of times this is lost, is that once it's registered, right, the state's going to see that this has been transferred, and if Mike and I are in a state that does in fact apply sales or use tax to an aircraft sale, we could potentially be responsible for another round of sales or use tax. Now, to give you an example, let's just say that this aircraft was valued at $60,000. So what happens is Mike and I, A and B, we pay Ferdy off right as he's leaving his $20,000 on the airplane, and now Mike and I are potentially subject to whatever percentage it is. Let's say it's a 5% tax on that $20,000.
But you two already own the aircraft.
It's a new co-ownership.
Now you two still own the aircraft.
We do, but now we own more of the aircraft. All right,
okay.
so that's what we bought. We
Okay.
bought that additional 1/3 interest from you. Now each of us are presumably 50-50 owners. So we have now purchased that additional percentage of the aircraft, which we're going to have to pay sales tax on, as long as the state does have sales or use tax that's applicable to this particular purchase. So that's the sort of thing you would see in what I'll call an internal transfer.
Right. All right. So how about another situation?
The other situation is probably simpler, but this is where the three of us have decided that we're going to move on.
I'm back. So
You're back now. We're presuming that Ferdy is back in the fold.
we got the band back together,
Right.
and the three of us are going to sell the airplane to somebody else.
That's right.
Okay.
And so now it's a little bit simpler. It's just a matter of A, B, and C, all of us signing a bill of sale, transferring it to this third party we're talking about, whoever that might happen to be.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And now, of course, it's the third party's issue with respect to sales and use tax on this deal. Okay. And the third party is going to have to register it in their name.
Mm-hmm.
So that sort of transfer at the end of the co-ownership is relatively easy to deal with.
All right. Well, I think we've hit the end of our slides. So let's take a look at some of the questions we have coming in. Let's see. So tax, we hit on tax there a good bit with that pie, baking up that piece of the pie and fractional, additional, incremental tax bills and whatnot. So if you buy into an existing co-ownership, is there sales tax due to the state?
Yes.
Some.
If the state has a sales and use tax provision, right? Let's just say, for instance, that Mike and I, after you left the co-ownership, right, now we're just A and B, and now a new C shows up at the doorstep.
Let's call them D instead, shall we?
Thank you. That
Okay.
makes it clearer. Thank you, Ferdy. So now we've got D walks through the door.
Right.
If we're going to sell that 1/3 interest to D for that $20,000 we were talking about before, D is potentially responsible for sales or use tax on that $20,000, depending on the state's rates.
Right. And just for illustrative purposes, D leaves and E comes in, same thing happens again.
That's
E
right,
leaves,
it's a new
F comes
transfer.
in, same thing happens again.
That's right. Each time, you got to remember that sales and use tax is based on a transfer of tangible personal property, which an aircraft is, to another party. And that's what's going to trigger that sales and use tax.
Okay. Earlier on, I talked about, if you have different states, multiple states involved, depending on where the transaction occurs, for example, that led to a different question coming in, which is, and I know we can't answer every combination because it's literally incalculable, but give us a general idea. How does sales tax play in when there are co-owners who are residents of 2 or more states?
Well, in essence, there's really 2 points of contact that need to be thought about. The first one is going to be where you take delivery of the aircraft, okay? Because at that point, you're talking about a sales tax. So you should be looking carefully at the state's rules and laws where you're taking delivery to determine, most importantly, whether or not there's any kind of what we call flyaway exemption. Right? A flyaway exemption means that if you take delivery of the aircraft in our state and move it out of our state, usually within a certain number of days, it might be 10 days, might be 30 days, might be other conditions, then you don't have to pay sales and use tax to that state where you took delivery. So that's point of contact number 1 that needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm.
Point of contact number 2 that needs to be addressed is not necessarily where the co-owners might reside, but where that aircraft is going to be based and used.
Mm-hmm.
That's why they call the flip side to the sales tax the use tax. And so if the aircraft is going to be based and used in a state that has a sales and use tax, because they often go together, they do go together, then even if you had the flyaway exemption from sales tax in point A, in point B where you're basing and using it, you may have to pay the use tax there.
Mm-hmm. All right, moving on from taxes, let's get a little subjective and do a little hangar talk here. Tell us a good place or places to advertise or find other pilots who are also looking for other co-owners in our local area. Any ideas, any thoughts on how you might go about that? For example, I might go on our new AOPAhangar.com media platform and try to find other pilots in my area who might have similar interests as far as what types of flying they might want to do and what kind of aircraft they might be interested in. That's a more high-tech solution. On the other hand, maybe the bulletin board or the glass wall at the cafeteria at your airport.
Sure, every airport has a bulletin board. Some that have cafes also have bulletin boards in the cafe. Even here at Frederick, you'll even see advertisements in the bathrooms.
Mm-hmm.
But there are other sources as well. If you're interested in a particular type airplane, you can go to a Type Club website, for instance, and interact with members there and try and locate members in your area, and then try to make contact for those purposes. So that's another source. Of course, word of mouth is a great source for tracking airplanes.
Mm-hmm.
There are oftentimes airplanes for sale that don't appear in the controller or Barnstormers, and that can be a valuable source as well. Of course, you can also go to the major fly-ins like Sun and Fun and AirVenture, and make some contacts there. So there's a host of ways to make contact with other aircraft owners and track down airplanes.
Okay, great, good ideas. Finally, if someone is interested in co-ownership, do we have any documentation we can provide them with as far as maybe a sample co-ownership agreement?
I knew you were going to bring that up.
Yeah, I know.
The dreaded words around
I
here,
know.
a sample agreement.
There's no such thing as a sample agreement, right?
Right.
It's already on the way to being tailored towards your application.
Sample agreement for each of the 52 states.
Well, the good point, right? The good point to make there is that these are, often agreements that are driven by state law. The fear that we often have with samples or templates is that they may be misused by, non-lawyers. There are different templates floating around. I think years ago, AOPA may have had one out there. I'm not sure if it's still online with you guys, but we would try to keep people away from it and send them to lawyers to do it. But that is a good point, and there are indeed some, I think AOPA does have one. It's been out there for a while. It's very comprehensive. It may be too comprehensive, but it's a helpful start. You could bring it to your lawyer and have them work that up and use that as a checklist at least for what you're going to be doing.
Okay, good advice. On that note, gentlemen, let's go ahead and wrap it up. I really appreciate all your time and information, and it was a pleasure getting to spend some time with you.
Real
Enjoyed
pleasure.
it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, everybody.
All right, and thanks so much for joining us, our viewers as well. If you have any questions as part of your membership with AOPA, you can contact our Pilot Information Center staff Monday through Friday at 1-800-USA-AOPA. That's 800-872-2672. Or you can email us your questions at pilotassist@aopa.org. Also, please subscribe to this YouTube channel using the red subscribe button just below the video. And don't forget to check out our website at www.aopa.org. Thanks for joining us.